Today's daf is daf tzadi hey, and we'll begin with iboilahu, which is approximately 7 or 8 lines down from the top. So our discussion is about the lechem haponim, and the Gemara raises the following issue, which is going to be a machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Iboilahu lechem haponim nifsal b'masos, when they were in the midbar. And as soon as they got the call from above to move and remove the encampment so that they moved forward, they packed up the Mishkan, and after taking it apart, they brought it with them through the Midbar. And now what's happening is that there are lechamim, lechem aponim, on the shulchan. And now the issue is whether these lechem aponim become psulim with a psul called yotze, which means that whenever you take kodshim out of its allotted location, then it's pasul midin yotze. And now, since they took apart the Mishkan, obviously the shulchan is no longer in the heichal. And even if we had assume, which is going to be an issue unto itself, whether or not when they carried the shulchan, they would carry the lechem aponim that were already placed on the shulchan with them. But even so, the shulchan is not located in the heichal while they're traveling from one area to another, one masa to the other. So the Gemara vacillates now. O lo nifsal, eno nifsal b'masos. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, chanomer nifsal, v'chanomer eno nifsal. So the Gemara is going to now analyze the machlokes amoraim as to whether or not the lechem aponim, assuming they are still on the shulchan as Bnei Yisrael move from one masa to the other, does the shulchan in motion still have the status of the shulchan, such that the lechem aponim, insofar as it's in its proper location, is not yotze, it's not posel midin, taking it out of its place. Mandiyom nifsal, according to one mandiyom, the lechem aponim became posel tichsiv, and we derive this from a pasuk. Kasha yachnu kain yisu. There's an equation, an analogy here between the encampment and the journey. Ma b'chani also, just like when the Mishkan is standing in its place and Bnei Yisrael are encamped around the Mishkan, is nifsal biyotze if the lechem aponim were taken out of the let's say the chotzer of the Mishkan, so they become pasul midin yotze. And that's based on a pasuk, v'hoisa li Aaron ulebanov v'achaluhu b'makom kadosh. Af b'nisyaso nifsal b'yotze. So this analogy tells me that so too when they are traveling in their journeys from one encampment to the other, it's pasul midin yotze. Mandi omer eno nifsal. Tichsivi has a different pasuk. V'lechem hatamid olav yiyeh. So then there's an extra word in this pasuk yiyeh, and that yiyeh is a ribui to tell you that the lechem is always considered olav, namely it's on the shulchan, even when Bnei Yisrael are traveling in the desert from one encampment to the other, meaning that the kedusha of the shulchan is maintained even during the masa, even the journey after the Mishkan was taken apart, and therefore assuming that the lechem remained on the shulchan even after they were given the marching orders to move on, but they didn't remove the lechem from the shulchan, so it remains in a kedushas makom in its designated place, and it's not yotze. So the Gemara now is going to go back and forth. Each raya for the mandiyomar is going to be a kasha for the other mandiyomar. V'idoch nami, if, for example, you're of the opinion that the lechem is still kosher because it remains on the shulchan, then haksiv, what are you going to do with the pasuk kasher yachnu ken yiso, the analogy from which we derive the conclusion according to that mandiyomar that the lechem became possible because just like bechaniyaso, if it leaves its makom, let's say it leaves the azara, it becomes possible biyotze. So too, if it leaves, after the masa, it leaves its place. And the Gemara pulls a very sharp move over here, like a surprising fastball, I call it. Le'ida kisa. Instead of equating the masa with the chaniyah, let's do it in the other direction. B'chaniyaso. Yeah, you want to derive from chaniyah in a case where it left its makom, and therefore it's possibly din yotze. Let's derive it from chaniyaso, kilo yatzam imkomo. If it didn't leave lamazog in the azara, is therefore af benisiyaso kilo yatzam imkomo. If it remains on the shulchan, which is called a makom for the lechem aponim, it doesn't become pasul midin yotze. So don't derive from this equation between chaniyaso and nisiyaso that the lechem became pasul because, like in chaniyah, if it leaves its makom, it's pasul. But on the contrary, let's derive from this analogy that it remains kosher. And the reason it remains kosher is because it's still, even b'nisiyaso, on the shulchan, which is its place. Now, the thought occurs to my mind that the Gemara should have analyzed a more fundamental, basic question, and that is when you take apart the Mishkan, is there still Kedushas HaMishkan while it's B'masa, while it's taken apart piece by piece, and the Bnei Yisrael are journeying from one camp to the other? I don't know. Maybe the Gemara thinks, as a Davar Poshet, that the Shulchan is a separate entity, independent of the rest of the Mishkan, and even if I grant you that the Mishkan B'Nisiyasa loses its Kedusha, but nevertheless the Shulchan retains its Kedusha, because we're not taking apart the Shulchan. Anyway, Ve'idach Nami, let's go according to the Mandiyamar, who says that the Lechem Aponim becomes invalidated and puzzle in the Nesiah. Haksiv, but what are you going to do with the pasuk that says Lechem Hatamid Alav Yeh? And the Gemara assumes that no one could argue. It's a davar pashut that the word Yeh is telling you that b'kedusha sotia, that the lechem remains kadosh and valid, even bi tamid, meaning even b'masa. So the word tamid means a constancy; it's constant, and that proves that the lechem aponim constantly are kosher. And at this point, the Gemara now backtracks and offers another interpretation of this machlokes based on the assumption that everybody would agree that lechem atamid olav yeh teaches me that the lechem on the shulchan remains kosher. Elaki Asr Avdimi, where Avdimi came from Etzil to Bavel, Omar, he declared, B'misudar, if the lechem upon him during the masa was left on the shulchan, kuli almalo pligi, Everybody agrees that it's kosher. Eliki pligi. So what is this? The field of the machlokas of the controversy? B'misulach. They took the lechem off the shulchan while they carried it from one location to the other. And now we don't understand how it's possible b'misulach that the lechem upon him is not posel midin yotze. Mandi omer nifsal. That's simple. B'chsiv kasher yachnu kein yisol. And that pasuk teaches me that there's a basic halacha of psul yotze, both bechania and b'masa, and certainly since the lechem is taken off the shulchan, it's possible. Ma b'chaniyasa nifsal b'yotze, b'nisyasa nifsal b'yotze. Lamandi already nifsal, but here's where we have to figure out how could it be that the lechem upon him that was taken off the shulchan is not possible b'din yotze? We have to derive from a special pasuk, v'nasa ohel moed, that the Mishkan itself retains its kedusha even after it was removed from its place. Ohel moed, afal pisha nasa ohel moedhu. It retains its status as a Mishkan, as an ohel moed, even when it was taken apart and brought from place to place. And therefore, I don't care if it's Mesulach and they already took the lechem upon him off the shulchan. That's irrelevant. Why? Because wherever they go, they're going with the Mishkan, and the Mishkan is kadosh, and it retains its kedusha, even b'masa, because the Torah says v'nasa ol moed. It's still called an ol moed. It's still called a Mishkan. Now, in order to appreciate this Gemara, that maintains that it's called an ol moed even b'nisiyasa, we have to introduce a concept called Machnos Yisrael and Digle Yisrael. And what that means is that there were the Golim as they traveled in the Mishkan, and let's say, for example, the first degel up front was Shevet Yehuda, and then came Shevet, three other Shvatim, then came Ruvain, and so forth, so then Dan, and then Ephraim, right? So what's happening is that after Shevet Yehuda moves forward and Shevet Ruvain moves forward, then the Mishkan is brought at that spot. That spot, which is between the second Machna and the third Machna, is called the Machna Leviyah. And the Mishkan in the Machna Leviyah, as it's traveling through the desert, surrounded by the various Machnos and the Degolim, retains its status as the Ol Moed. So in other words, just like Bechaniyasan, the Ol Moed, or the Mishkan, if you want to call it that, was placed in a certain location, surrounded, as it were, with two Machnos on one side, and on its other side, another two Machnos, with two Degolim here and another two Degolim there. That's the makom of the Mishkan, at least to generate its status as an Ol Moed. And if you could imagine that entire, formation moving forward, b'nisiyasam, so the Mishkan still retains its status as an Ol Moed because nothing changed in terms of its formation. The idach nami, and now we want to go to the other Mandiyom who says that no, no, no. I'm sorry. We're not going to the other Mandiyomar. We're still within the context of this Mandiyomar, who holds that the Ol Moed still retains its status even b'masa, but nami oksiv kasher yachnu keni so. He should admit that the lechem upon become possible b'masa because of the analogy between masa and chanoya. And in chanoya, there's a psul yotze, and therefore there should be a psul yotze in the case of the lechem aponim b'masa because it was taken off the shulchan. So the Gemara answers Leidach Gisa Ma b'chaniyasu kilo ma piklelo mifsal ach b'nesiyasu kilo ma piklelo nifsal. It never really left, and just like in Chanoya, if it never left, it doesn't get puzzled. So to b'masa, if it never left, it right? What does it mean? It never left. It was taken off the shulchan, but it still is in the Machna Levia. The Machna Levia, where the Mishkan, the Ol Moed, is set in its place and still retains its kedusha, based on the pasuk V'nasa Ol Moed V'idach Nami. What about the other Mandi Omer, who says that the Lechem Aponim is Posel Midin Yotze, but wait a second, the pasuk says Ksiv V'nasa Ol Moed, so it still retains its status as an Ol Moed, and therefore how can you call it Yotze if the Mishkan is now moving along through the journeys through the desert, located in the Machna Levia? That's its place. It still retains its kedusha as the old Moed, and therefore the Lechem Aponim never left. There's no psul yotze. So the Gemara answers, "Ahulid golim hu diyasa." No, no, no. That pasuk of an asa old Moed is not telling us that the sanctity of the old Moed and its status still is retained while they're b'masa. That's not the point of the pasuk. The pasuk is just telling us that they would travel through the midbar with the same formulation of the degolim as was necessary when they were bechanoya, when they were in their place. He tells you in the footnote to look up in Bamidbar Perik Beis to see how the Torah delineates the sequence in which the Golim moved out, which Degel went first, which came afterwards, and so forth and so on. So now this pasuk is teaching us that the Mishkan, the Old Moed, remained in its same place in sequence, meaning after the second, which is the Degel Machne Ruvain, and before the next Degel, which is Shevet Dan. The Idach. Oh, if he's using the pasuk of V'nasa Ol Moed to tell us that the status of the Ol Moed is retained even b'masa, even in the midbar, is how he's going to derive the conclusion that the Mishkan has to be located in the same sequence, meaning after the first two Degolim, before the last two Degolim. Where does he derive that from? Machna Levim b'toch ha-machnos nafke. And I believe what's going on here is that the Gemara is revealing two different principles. Number one, that from this pasuk we derive that the Ol Moed retains its position in the sequence of the Golim. And number two, it retains its status and its kedusha because it's still located in the Machna Levia. Now, the Gemara Mesve is not happy with Rav Dimi's explanation of the Mandiyama, who says that the lechem upon remain kosher even b'masa mesve. What about the following brisa? B'shas siluk masos kodshim in general, all-encompassing term kodshim nifsalim v'yotze v'zavin u'mitzuran mishtalchin chutz lemechitzasa. And there's a difference here between the zav and the Mitzorah. This week's parsha is about the Mitzorah. The Mitzorah was sent chutz l'shalosh machnos, whereas the Zav is only sent chutz mishnei machnos. In any event, what the Bryce is saying is that although the halachos of shiluach machnos for tmeim is removed, is poka, just one second. Wait, how do we understand the words chutz limchitzasa? So, if I understand correctly, the way the Gemara understands this brisa, we have to distinguish between two issues. One issue is the Kedushas Machnos, and the other issue is Kedushas HaChotzer, or the Heichal in the Beis Hamikdash, or in the Mishkan, call it the Chotzer. And the Gemara is saying that once they went on the journey and they had to roll up the paroches, the curtain that separates the chotzer from the other machnos, then there would be a psul yotze in the kodesh. But at the same time, the machnos retain their status. And therefore the zav has to be sent out of the machne shechina, so here I'm not 100% sure. Not sure exactly. There's a Machne Shechina, the Machne Levi, and the Machne Yisrael. As again, I know that the Mitzora has to be sent even out of the Machne Yisrael. I know that the Zav is not sent out of the Machne Yisrael, but it is sent out of the Machne Shechina. I'm not sure right now, I'm sorry I'm blanking out, what the din of the Zav is as far as the Machne Leviyah. So I thought maybe he would address this, but right now I don't see it. In any event, the Gemara seems at this point in the Meisvei to be absolutely satisfied with this distinction. But the Gemara says, Lo, bar mi lechem upon it. And now we really get into trouble. The plot grows thicker because now he's saying that the lechem upon him, insofar as they're still, even b'masa, in the machna levia, because we still have the machnos, and the proof of the pudding is because Zavid and Mitzvah mishtachlim chutz the machnos. Therefore, the lechem upon him remains kosher. But wait a minute, the Brisa says that kodshim nifsalim biyotze. Mimonefshach. I ol moed dafkahu. If you're going to tell me that, according to this Mandi Omer, the reason why lechem upon him b'masa are not posmidin yotze is because the old moed retains its status, is then afilu kodshim nami. Why aren't you consistent? And the same halach should apply to all kodshim. The kodshim have not been removed from the Makom Kadosh. And Iol Moed Lav Dafkahu, and B'masa, the Kedushas Ol Moed is Pakad, completely removed, is then a few Lechem upon him Nami, the Lechem upon him likewise should be Pasul Midin Yotze. So therefore, the only conclusion that we can get from this Brisa is that the Lechem upon him is included under Kodshim, and the general rule that b'masa, we've taken apart the Mishkan, the Parochas is not there anymore to separate it. It lost its status as an old Moed. And therefore, just like Kodshim Apostle B'Yotzei, so too Lechem Aponim is Apostle B'Yotzei. So I think at this point the word Ella is critical. We should underline it because I think the Gemara is now backpedaling, and coming up with a new interpretation of this machlokas. Ki asa Ravin, right? Until now we were dealing with Rav Dimi, and that didn't succeed. Now we're dealing with Ravin, who came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. Mar Omar b'Misudar, Umar Misudar v'lo pligi. Guess what? We've been working and sweating a whole Amud here. There is no machlokas. They're just talking about two different cases. According to one Mandi Omar, it's possible the lechem upon him is possible midin yotze because it was taken off the shulchan. According to the other Mandi Omar, it was still Mesudar. Meaning, when they took apart the Mishkan to bring it with them in the Masa, journeying from one encampment to another in the wilderness, they took the Shulchan with the Lechem upon him on top of it. And therefore, that's called Mesudar. And we don't need a status of an Old Moed. Even if the status of the Old Moed is gone, but nevertheless it still retains the Kedusha Shulchan, and therefore there's no Yotze, because even B'masa, the Lechem upon it was still on the Shulchan, whereas the other Mandiyom is talking about B'misulach. They took the bread off. Now, what would make that decision whether to keep it on or take it off, I do not know. We'll see about David HaMelech later on. Maybe that's going to help us. But be that as it may, the two opinions are not two opinions at all. There's no controversy. They're talking about two different realities. Omar Abaye. Now, this is a little bit of a digression. It has to do with the Psul Yotze, but it really touches on the question of whether they journeyed at night. Omar Abaye Shmami no yesh siluk masos balayla. In other words, they took apart the Mishkan at night when they got the word that it's time to move on. And they started the journey at night. They didn't wait until the morning. Because Isal Kedak, if you don't agree with me, and you're going to tell me that Siluk Masos Balayla. does not exist, that they never would take apart the Mishkan at night and wait until the morning to start their journey, which again in our Metzius, in today's environment, that might be a good idea, because of all the security. You're better off traveling at day but at night than Emas Midale. Why, when did they leave the encampment and take apart the Mishkan? Litzafra, they waited till the morning. If that be the case, what are you talking? You're racking your brains whether or not there's a psul yotze. Forget about the psul yotze, the psul lina. Ma mishum yotze typically the ifsale belina. Right? Any kudshim that was left beyond the nighttime, except for shlomim, that could be the second night. But anyway, is possibly din lina. And now you've taken apart the Mishkan in the morning. He says, according to Abaye, if the masos would never begin at night, so even though they got the command that it's time to move on, they would not take apart the Mishkan until the next morning when they started their journey, then any kudshim that existed the next morning would be already posel midin lina. The Brisa did not therefore have to invalidate them because of Yotze. It could have possibly because of Lina. Unless the Brisa assumes that Yesh Siluk Masos Balayl. So I assume if Yesh Siluk Masos Balayla, they could eat the Lechem Aponim or any Konchim during the course of the night. Pshita. Why did Abai have to rack his brains to learn this and derive it? Leleches Yom V'Laila. The pasuk itself tells me explicitly that they used to travel both by day and by night. Mao the Tema would have thought, if not for Abaye, Hani Mili Hechidi Akar V'Yamama. It's only when they started the journey in day they would continue the journey at night. They wouldn't stop with nightfall. If they didn't start during the day, is balayla lo motzi ikre. They could not start at night. Kamash Malana once tell me no. Obviously, from our diuk, from the fact there's no psul of lina, but rather only a psul of yotze, it means that they would travel at night and start the journey at night. Reminu. Now we have another brisa that seems to contradict this. Hugulu aparochas, when they rolled up the curtains. Hutru azovim tzoroim likonis l'sham. There was no din of shiluach machnos because the machnos depend upon the kedushas hamishkan, and the mishkan is no longer because they rolled up the paroches. And that's against the first brisa that says that even after they removed the paroches, the Zavin and Tzoroim was sent out of their respective machnos. Omer of Ashi Lokasha Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanon. This Sanya. And now we're going to learn about a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanon